Hey guys, so today we're going to actually kind of move away from talking about cells and focus in on the plant part of this biology unit. We'll start today just by kind of going over in general the different ways that plants are specialized, and then after that we'll be getting into kind of zooming in on the leaf structure. So when we were talking about characteristics of living things, we talked about how there's different levels of organization in all living things. You go from cells to tissues to organ systems. And we usually think about those in animals or humans, but they also exist in plants. So that's what we're going to be focusing on for today's lesson. So you do need to know how multicellular organisms are organized. You need to know the different types of organ systems that exist in plants, and the different types of plant tissues and what they do. So multicellular organisms are any organism that is made of more than one cell. If it's only one cell, we call it unicellular. That would be like a bacteria or something like that. But plants and animals are all multicellular. Multicellular organisms are really complex and they are highly differentiated, meaning that different cells in that multicellular organism do different things so that they can kind of like have specialized functions. It makes them function more efficiently. Cells, tissues, and organ systems all need to be kind of organized so that they can function effectively together. The specialization of different types of cells and organs and stuff like that is sometimes called the division of labor. So the upside of being multicellular is that you can have larger organisms, which can be useful when you're, trying to get away from predators and stuff like that. There's also a more variety in the different types of cells, which means that the functions are more specialized and therefore more effective, and the organisms can be more complex. And on the right-hand side here, we just have examples of kind of the differentiation of cells. So you can have nerve cells, blood cells, muscle cells, fat cells, bone cells, etc. So this is how it's all organized, and we've talked about this already. So if you have a bunch of cells that are working together for the same function, we call that a tissue. If a bunch of similar tissues are working together, we call it an organ, and then organs can work together to become an organ system. And organ systems include things like the circulatory system, or the respiratory system, or the digestive system, or the nervous system, or the lymphatic system. It's a bunch of different systems that allow us to function the way we do. So this is an example that applies to humans, where you would have a specialized cell, in this case a muscle cell, that comes together with other muscle cells to form muscle tissues. Those muscle tissues can then form an organ like the heart or the stomach or anything like that. In this case, the heart is part of the circulatory system, and then all of the different systems make up the human body. Specialization occurs whenever a certain type of tissue becomes designed to carry out a specific function. So when we see animal cells that don't look like the typical little circle blob, that means that it's highly specialized. The structure of a tissue or the structure of a cell is always going to be dependent on its function. So the structure will change based on its function. Whatever structure allows it to do its job most effectively is the structure that we will see. And cells can specialize from stem cells, which are just kind of generic cells that don't have a specific function, into different types of cells like nerve cells and skin cells and that sort of thing. Nerve cells, which are incredibly highly specialized, don't look anything like that typical little circle animal cell. They have like a wiggly end and then a long skinny part and then another wiggly end. They look very strange if you're just expecting a normal circle animal cell. And that's because of how highly specialized they are. That structure allows them to complete their function most effectively. In plants, these three types of cells are kind of broad categories of highly specialized cells. So you have root hairs, which are cells in the roots They're not actually hairs, but they're like long and skinny, so they kind of look like hair. And the reason for that is that their job is to absorb water. And the more surface area they have, the more effectively they can absorb water. By being long and skinny, you have a lot of surface area and a very small volume, which allows them to absorb water really effectively. And that's an example of root hairs down here that's very zoomed in. And then you have dermal cells, which are cells that kind of make up the outside of the plant. We'll talk more about that later. And then there's guard cells, which are cells that kind of are this sort of a shape, and they open or close the hole, which is called the stoma, in leaves in order to let gases in and out and stuff like that. So then we're going to move up to the next level of organization, which is tissues. So we have dermal tissue, which is called the epidermis, and it is made up of dermal cells. The dermal tissue, or the epidermis layer, covers the outside of non-woody plants. So the green outside of plants is the dermal tissue. It is where gas exchange occurs in both the stem and the leaves, so where oxygen leaves and carbon dioxide comes in. It's also there to protect the plant from diseases, just like our skin protects us from infection. And then some stems and leaves will also secrete a waxy substance from the dermal layer. That waxy substance is called the cuticle, and it'll kind of cover the outside of the epidermis, and it prevents water loss and also helps protect against infection and stuff like that. Underneath that dermal tissue, you then have something called ground tissue, which makes up the majority of a plant. Up here, you can see like a cross section. So this would be like if you had like the stem of a plant going up and you cut it off this way. You just have a very thin layer of epidermis, or the dermal tissue, around the outside. And then most of the plant's thickness is made up with ground tissue. It is found right below the epidermis, and it provides strength and support for the stem so that it can grow tall without flopping over. It also stores food and water that are in the roots. In the leaves, it's where photosynthesis happens. And again, we're going to talk more about the leaf structure later on. And in this area, the cells are more loosely packed together than they are in the dermal tissue, so that gases like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water vapor can travel through them quickly, since those gases are needed for photosynthesis, and that's where photosynthesis happens. And then underneath that, you can actually see it in the middle of this picture here. We have the vascular tissue, and the vascular tissue is responsible for transport in plants, which we have a whole lesson on later. But essentially, the xylem and the phloem tubes, or the xylem and phloem tissue that makes up those tubes, are kind of under the umbrella of vascular tissue. The xylem tube moves water and dissolved minerals from the roots, where they're absorbed through the root hairs, up to the leaves, where that water can be used for photosynthesis. And then the phloem tissue moves sucrose, which is a type of sugar, and other dissolved sugars from the leaves, where they are made during photosynthesis, down to the rest of the plant, where they can be stored and used for energy. And then those different groups of tissues can come together to form organ systems in plants. There are two different organ systems in plants. There's the shoot system and the root system. The shoot system is mostly above ground, so it includes like the flower, the stem, the leaves, that kind of stuff. It also includes something called tubers, which are the only part of the shoot system that's underground. They are swollen stems that are used for sugar storage underground. But for the most part, the shoot system is responsible for gas exchange. So again, carbon dioxide and oxygen in and out. Photosynthesis happening in the leaves. Reproduction, so producing like pollen and stuff like that. And the transport of molecules, so our vascular tissue. And then the root system is made up of the roots, which are usually below ground, but not always. And that is where water, oxygen, and minerals are absorbed from the soil and then transported upwards to the shoot system. It's also where some of the food is stored, so some of the sugars and stuff like that is stored, and also helps to anchor the plant to the ground. So this is just kind of what that differentiation would look like. Again, anything above ground is the shoot system, unless you have roots traveling across the top of the ground. And then of course the root system is just the roots. The one thing I would point out here is, again, you can have those tubers, which are part of the shoot system, but are underground. Okay, that's it for today's lesson.